everybody, and welcome to the Raccoon Club podcast. In this podcast, we're going to talk about a personal pet peeve of mine, which is the compulsive need to blame millennials for everything, and how I think millennials are actually getting shafted by all of this. So if you're not familiar, there's this trend now in politics, and particularly in business, of blaming millennials for the failures of products, for the slowdown in sales, for pretty much everything. And a huge part of this has to do, I think, with two things. One is an actual fundamental misunderstanding or ignorance in terms of what millennials want and the challenges they're facing. And number two is a failure to understand how generations get to express themselves. So first of all, we have to define what millennials are. And so for all the things I'm going to be quoting today, for the most part, they're all coming from Pew Research, which is one of the top research firms in the world. And according to Pew Research, they're defining millennials as people born between 1981 and 1996. Okay, so if you're born between 1981 and 1996, you're a millennial. If you're born just before that, you're a Gen Xer. If you're born before that, you're a boomer. So let's start off by talking about all the things that millennials have been blamed for over the last year. So again, all this is mostly from Pew Research. According to CBS Money Watch, millennials are being blamed for the downturn in sales of bars of soap. And according to the article, millennials believe bars of soaps are covered in germs after they're used. And so that's the reason why they're not buying bars of soap. Unfortunately for bars of soap makers, millennials are actually correct. According to Minnesota's Department of Health, bars of soap are indeed covered in germs after use. Vacations. Millennials are also being blamed for the downturn in vacations and cruise ships, which again comes to no surprise considering that millennials are broke. So you can hardly blame them for not being able to afford a $10,000 cruise and vacation, but they are being blamed for such things. The death of the 9-to-5 work week is being blamed on millennials. Millennials are demanding a lot more flexibility in their jobs, and because of which, nearly 40% of U.S. workers can work from home at least one day a week, according to a 2016 study, again, according to Pew Research. The irony, of course, is that with a flexible schedule, employees tend to be happier and more productive in their careers. The slowdown in casual dining has been blamed on millennials. According to brands and franchises such as TGI Friday, Ruby Tuesday, Applebee's, Buffalo Wild Wings, all these brands have actually blamed the trends of millennial eating habits in terms of the slowdown of their sales and growth. It should once again come to no surprise because millennials have fundamentally different eating habits than the boomer generation. Millennials tend to eat healthier on average. They tend to skew more vegan and vegetarian. They tend to eat a lot less meat. So it's no surprise that existing fast food and casual dining franchises and business models are being affected by this. In the same vein, dinner dates, the death of dinner dates are also being blamed on millennials. With the rise of apps such as Tinder and OkCupid, millennials are having more frequent dates, and as a result, they're not spending as much per date each time. So instead of going sort of to a traditional sit-down dinner, they're meeting up for coffee, they're meeting up for drinks. A lot of them are just going straight to Netflix and chill. So as a result of which, the dining industry as a whole is seeing this sort of drop-off in sales. Napkins, the death of napkins is being blamed on millennials because millennials are actually choosing to use paper towels more than anything else. Again, totally logical if you think about it. Paper towels are actually a lot more practical and do a much better job cleaning up than napkins. And as a result of it, the napkin industry is blaming millennials for their sales slumps. The sport of golf is blaming millennials. for what may actually be the extinction of the sport itself. Millennials are playing far less golf than the boomer generation is. So much so that people estimate that in 57 to 60 years, the sport of golf itself may go extinct. There may not be enough players to support the industry worldwide. Millennials are playing less golf, they're watching less golf, they're following less golf, and the golf industry is blaming their failures on millennials in this regard. Perhaps the biggest thing millennials are blamed for is the drop-off in home ownership. So what's happening is that millennials, their lifestyle is demanding for them to be a lot more travel-friendly. They have to move from city to city often to get jobs and to look for work and to go to school. They're renting more and not buying enough houses. So this is actually creating sort of a bizarre crunch for the industry where there seems to be a slowdown in terms of new home development because millennials are not buying homes. Other things that millennials are blamed for, the slowdown in the diamond industry, especially the wedding and engagement ring industry, a slowdown in the running industry. So running and jogging, the sport itself is taking a beating because millennials are doing other things such as CrossFit and yoga. My personal favorite, NBC Universal, back in 2012, if I'm not mistaken, blame millennials for the significant drop-off in ratings for the Olympics, not realizing, of course, that millennials are not interested in sitting in front of a TV set for 8 hours a day. They'd much rather watch sports on their iPhones or on their tablets. But blaming millennials for the drop-off in ratings of $1 billion sports empire, to me, is just hysterical. So let's dig a little deeper into why all this is actually happening and why millennials are taking the blame. So first, some more facts for you. As of the last census in 2015, the number of boomers in America was around 75 million, and the number of millennials in 2015 was around 75 million. And by 2028, millennials will overtake boomers as the number one demographic in America. And that's just extraordinarily powerful because for the first time in like 40 to 50 years, the boomer generation is no longer the center of marketing, is no longer the center of business, is no longer the center of demographics. For the last 40 or 50 years, the boomer generation has defined everything. Entire categories have been developed in anticipation for the boomer generation beginning to spend their money. And as that generation starts to wind down, existing business models, existing business structures, even existing financial models are having a great deal of difficulty adjusting to this new demographic shift. One of the things that I hear again and again by commentators is how stupid the millennial generation is. Again, according to Pew Research, millennials are on track to be the most educated generation to date, with 21% of millennial men and 27% of millennial women getting at least a bachelor's degree. And to put that in perspective, that is for men about a 3-point difference than boomers, and for women a 7-point difference for boomers. So they are certainly learning a lot more. They're graduating in larger numbers with bachelor degrees, yet somehow the impression about millennials is that they're this idiot generation. One of the other popular myths about millennials is that they're lazy. In particular, there's this sort of almost meme that goes around about how millennials are job hoppers, how they don't stick with one job long enough, how they're constantly shifting from one career to another career. So again, let's look at the data. According to Pew Research, 63% of employed millennials were with their current employer for at least 13 months. And 22% of millennial workers had been with their employer for at least 5 years as of 2016. So these numbers are equal to or better than the Generation X demographic. So that means that millennials are matching or improving upon the statistics of Generation X. The idea that they're somehow job hopping and don't have the patience to build a career is complete bunk. So what is driving this wedge between boomers and millennials? What is the reason that's causing millennials to be picked on by the boomer generation so much? And again, 10-second Google search will show you what I mean in terms of the amount of flack that millennials have gotten. Well, I think it's a few things, and I think they're all kind of stunning in terms of what they mean towards the nation, what they mean towards economies, and in particular, the blind spot that the boomer generation seems to have about the millennial generation staking out its claim in the world. So let's start with politics. As of 2016, millennials were the most democratic and liberal-leaning generation ever. As a percentage of the Democratic Party, 27% of millennials and 21% of Gen Xers identified as liberal Democrats or Democratic-leaning independents. That's a pretty large number. It's actually the largest it's ever been. By contrast, however, of course, boomers and the silent generation, which is sort of the older generation right now, tend to vote highly Republican, and nearly a third of boomers, 31%, and over a third of the silent generation, 36%, describe themselves as conservative Republicans or conservative leaning, which is also higher than it's ever been. So what you're seeing is this polarization between generations. The millennials are going further and further left. The boomers are going further and further right. And what that tends to mean is that they're looking at the world in fundamentally different ways. Millennials are also disproportionately affected by the 2008 financial crash. Given the job market at that time, given the student debt at that time, millennials are far more burdened financially than boomers were around that stage in their lives, which means just as millennials are entering adulthood, just as they're entering the age of independence, they got smacked by this recession, a recession that in many ways we are still struggling to get out of. The jobs that normally would have been there for entry-level millennials were no longer there when it was time for them to look for work. So you have an entire generation of kids graduating university just when corporate America was shutting down its doors, just when manufacturing plants were shutting down their plants. Any sort of perceived notion of millennials and their employment has to be viewed by that perspective. Contrast that to the boomer generation that when they were graduating, America was booming. It was a massive time of economic prosperity. Things were being built all over the states. There was tons of manufacturing jobs. There was tons of infrastructure jobs. Lots of corporations were hiring because there was a huge expansion during that time. So boomers had sort of the luck of history on their side, and they had the luck of economics on their side. So how does that liberal conservative division between boomers and millennials manifest themselves? Well, it's sort of interesting. The Pew Research did a poll where they asked people the strength of America. What do you attribute to? Do you attribute it to ability to change, or do you attribute it to reliance on longstanding principle? 62% of millennials said that the U.S. has been successful because of its ability to change, whereas 49% of boomers said it was due to its reliance on principles. So one generation is not afraid of change, in fact, believes that change is a fundamental component to American success, while the boomer generation believes that it is America's standing with principle, the lack of change, the rigidity of things that make it successful. One of the other massive, and I would actually argue probably the number one reason why there is this massive disconnect between boomers and millennials is race. Boomers are overwhelmingly white. Millennials, however, 43% of them are non-white, the highest share of any generation. So millennials not just are politically more liberal, but they're racially more diverse, which means that as a group, it is going to be extraordinarily difficult to apply a one-size-fits-all model to that generation and to that generation's needs. So what does all this mean? The boomer generation has been defined largely by race. It's been defined largely by economic status, including all the benefits they got when they first reached of age. The millennial generation, however, has been defined by a financial crisis,